This afternoon I'm going to begin an oil portrait, and the portrait will probably take about 3 sittings of roughly 3 hours each. During the demonstration of this portrait, I'll endeavor to explain as much as possible about the techniques and methods that I'll be using. To begin with, I'd like to show you the palette that I'm going to be using. There are a number of things about this palette that I consider to be significant. The first of which is this is an extra large palette. I had a carpenter cut the palette in the traditional size and shape, but to enlarge it so that it could accommodate all of the skin tone mixtures that I have here in the middle. The palette is a middle tone color. It's a somewhat greenish gray, and I have chosen a middle tone because all of the light colors will look lighter than the middle tone palette. The dark colors will look darker than the middle tone palette. Additionally, this palette has been made a cool color, and my general thinking is that the warm skin tones that I'll be using for the portrait will show up by contrast to greater advantage against a cool tone. Now, I have the colors arranged on my palette in a particular order, but it doesn't make any difference at all what the order is. What I do find significant, however, is that whatever order one chooses, I believe it a good idea to always place the colors in that same sequence every time you paint. Now, the order that I have is an order that begins with flake white. Now, white is the most important color used in painting. The kind of white that one selects greatly affects the drying time of the paint. There are fundamentally 2 techniques in oil painting. There are techniques in which the artists wish the paint to dry very slowly over a period of days or weeks in order that they can blend one wet color into another. An artist who worked in that technique was Leonardo da Vinci. And in the work of Leonardo da Vinci, there is no evidence of any brush stroke. Da Vinci blended all of the colors by virtue of having his paint wet for long periods of time, so that there is no trace of the method with which the picture was painted. The technique that I'm going to be employing is the opposite of that. And the technique I'll employ is one where one wants the paint to dry very rapidly so that the brush strokes will set in place and be very evident in the finished painting. A technique that requires fast drying paint requires the use of flake white. Flake white is the fastest drying paint. Now, some of the artists who worked in the technique of painting layer upon layer with fast drying paint were artists like Rembrandt and Velasquez and Sargent, and that is the technique that I will be employing. Now, flake white is a little difficult to manipulate. It's somewhat stiff, even though it's a fast drying white. So in the last several years, I have been recommending mixing 2 parts of flake white and 1 part of titanium white. Titanium white is a slightly slower drying white, but it imparts to the flake white a little bit more workability. Now, the next color on my palette is ivory black. Then I have Prussian blue, then raw sienna, yellow ochre, Naples yellow, cadmium yellow medium, and I'm emphasizing the word medium, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, burnt sienna, raw umber, burnt umber, sap green, and phthalo green. Now, this is the palette, the group of colors that I use for every painting that I do, be it a still life, a landscape, a portrait, or a figure painting. Now, the mixtures on the inside represent certain skin tones that one is likely to encounter during the painting process. These colors that have been mixed are different one from another. They have been graded from shade to tint in a series of values. Now, the word value relates to the light and dark quality of colors, and I'll be referring to the word value regularly throughout the painting process. This particular mixture is a combination of raw sienna and cadmium red and light, to which I have added white, and this makes a warm skin tone that's often useful for middle tones and for lights on portraits. This is yellow ochre, to which white has been added. Very often this is used for many of the light colors. This is a combination of yellow ochre and burnt sienna, these 2 colors mixed together with white added. These are also very useful for middle tones and for lights. This is burnt sienna with white added, and the burnt sienna occasionally is used for shadows, some areas for middle tone, some areas for lights. This is a string of raw umber to which white has been added, and that has many uses in painting portraits. This is a mixture of raw sienna and ivory black, which is a color with which I frequently draw, as I will be doing this evening, and to that I have added white. These offer very interesting cool tones for middle tones and for lights. In this range of colors are very dark reddish browns and greenish browns. This is a mixture of red and green. Red and green make brown. I've used the darkest red on my palette, alizarin crimson, and the darkest green, or one of the darkest greens on my palette, sap green. And in this mixture, I have simply combined the red and green, which makes the darkest brown that it is my experience can be mixed. In this direction, I have added a larger proportion of alizarin crimson, very little sap green, and I lighten this mixture not with white, but with cadmium yellow medium. And that produces a very strong rust color. These colors are particularly practical for warm skin tones on portraits. There are other uses to which they can also be put. In the other direction, the same components are used, sap green and alizarin crimson, but a much larger proportion of sap green. And this is again lightened with cadmium yellow medium, producing a sepia or greenish brown. This is often useful for cool skin tones. In this range are four colors that were favored by the 17th century Dutch painters. Each one of these mixtures is a combination of raw umber and yellow ochre. This is raw umber lightened slightly with yellow ochre. This is the same thing, raw umber lightened by the addition of still more yellow ochre. These two mixtures are also raw umber and yellow ochre, but I have added to them a warm color burnt sienna. And this is raw umber, yellow ochre, and burnt sienna, as is the last mixture. When I see these colors, I use them. If I see additional colors, I continue to mix them during the painting process.